With the terrible impact of the coronavirus on the United States, our hopes have turned to a COVID-19 vaccination. Today, we'll take a look at both the nation's ability to accelerate the vaccination release and states' ability to require or mandate vaccination. Hello and welcome to TalksOnLaw. I'm Joel Cohen. Today we're joined remotely by Professor Dorit Reiss of UC Hastings, a nationally recognized expert on vaccination law. Professor Reiss, welcome to TalksOnLaw.
It's great to be here.
Professor, there have been millions affected already by coronavirus in the United States. What is the hope? What is the hope for the vaccination?
So there's two parts to that. First, we'll probably have a vaccine sometime within the next year, maybe sooner than that. Second, there's a lot of questions about when do we have the vaccine, which vaccine will it be, and how do we get it to people, and who gets it first.
We're talking about vaccinations today. For many experts, vaccine seems to be the big hope.
On one hand, a vaccine would probably be the long-term answer to the pandemic. We have a number of vaccines in development, and if they pan out, they will dramatically reduce the pandemic to levels that won't require the same kind of response we had now. However, to get there, we have to overcome a lot of obstacles. It's not that there's going to be a vaccine approved in January and magically everything that we've done so far is going to go away. We're probably going to want to live with some restrictions for a while.
So we shouldn't be thinking about the vaccine as an on-off switch where we can just go back to our normal lives instantly.
Yes, don't plan on the big rock concerts the week after the vaccine.
Well, now that you've dashed our hopes somewhat, let's kick off this conversation. We're talking about, first off, what's the government's rules when it comes to vaccinations, as well as the ability of the president or the government to accelerate the vaccination release process?
So in normal time, vaccine development takes 10, 15 years, sometimes longer. We've already cut that by, in many diseases, we have to first identify the disease and then decide what kind of vaccine to use. We've overcome those two hurdles because we know what causes COVID-19, that's the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and we have over 100 vaccine candidates already in process. So we've overcome some of it. Still, getting to a vaccine candidate is just one step. You then need to show that the vaccine is safe and effective. That usually requires 3 stages of trial. Stage 1 with a small number of healthy volunteers to look at what the dosage is and are there any big safety concerns that come right up. Stage 2 with more volunteers, again, looking at does the vaccine work, is it safe? And stage 3, which is the deciding phase, where we look at is the safety profile acceptable? Are there more than very, very, very rare serious harms? And does the vaccine work? Does it actually prevent the disease? Because just seeing that it raises your antibody levels isn't enough to show that you're immune to the disease.
Maybe we should take those one at a time. What would be the regulations or the hoops that are needed for the first phase of the testing?
Before you get to the first human trial, you have to show the vaccine is reasonably safe and works in animals. We've already gone through that for quite a few vaccine candidates. And now we're looking at the human stages. One of the things the United States did to accelerate the trial is normally companies don't start larger trials until they're sure they have something in hand because larger trial costs money. The United States government gave money that allows companies to start bigger trial with a lower level of certainty.
Was this part of the CARES Act or a separate legislation?
It wasn't legislation. It was done. So the United States have a couple of executive agencies that have pots of money that can be used for development in such circumstances. And these pots of money are being used. Several companies have received hundreds of millions or up to $1 billion in money for vaccine development.
Are we talking about the FDA or another entity entirely?
It's a separate unit in the Department of Health and Human Services where the FDA is also located. It's called the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, or BARDA. And that authority has been in charge of giving large sums of money to several companies.
This isn't our first pandemic that the country has faced. It's not even our first coronavirus pandemic. Are there systems in place to accelerate the vaccination testing or vaccination creation process?
There are, and some of the things we're doing are drawing on previous experience in previous pandemics, such as the H1N1 in 2009. And some of them were created for this crisis, but are following kind of established guidelines. We have a new emergency law for this pandemic. We're using mostly established legal tools. Some of the ways we're using them are not usual, but the tools are tools that already existed.
We talked about phase one, which is animal testing. Am I saying it right? Are they phases? Is it phase one?
So you're saying it right, but the animal testing is before phase one. Before you get permission to do anything to humans, you have to put together a package that shows safety in animals, etc., in normal times. Phase one is the first stage in human volunteers, and it looks at a small number of healthy volunteers.
What's a small number? Are we talking about 20 or 50 or 100?
Between 20 and 100. So, for example, in one of the Moderna studies, they had 45 people.
And that has already been completed for some of the vaccinations?
For some of them, stage one have been completed. Now, we probably want to have different vaccine candidates. Some of them may be effective enough as a first stage and faster to develop, and some of them may be slower to develop, but be the ones we end up using in the long term.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, for most of us, we think a vaccine, there's one. So for polio, there's one vaccine, or for measles, there's one vaccine. Is that an accurate view, or are there multiple versions for each disease?
So, for example, for measles, we started with a killed measles vaccine in 1963, and that didn't pan out. We're now using a live measles virus vaccine because the killed one turned out not to be effective enough. And some of the technologies we're using now are new ones that we have not yet used for vaccines for preventing diseases.
Let's go through the phases while we're at it. So I have those ticked off. So phase one is the small pool, maybe under 100. What does phase two look like under normal circumstances? And what is it looking like now?
So phase two would normally go up to a few hundreds. It's actually not looking that different now. The difference is that they're overlapping the phases. So they're doing a phase 1/2, phase 2/3, where they're starting with a smaller number and then scaling up for 2 to 3, or they're starting with a small number for 1 and then scaling up to 2. So basically, they're collapsing the phases.
Was that type of accelerated option available prior to the current pandemic, or is this something where Health and Human Services is loosening the rules?
Having the stages of the overlap isn't as unusual. For example, stage 2 to 3, you start with a few hundred, and if it works, you add in more. That has been done before. Sometimes companies want to go back and do an earlier stage to see if there's a specific problem, is a real safety problem. So overlapping happened in the past and will probably happen again. Usually, companies don't move this fast to stage 3. Most vaccines in development fail stage 1. Most of them never get to stage 3 because stage 3 is so expensive. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars to do a stage 3 trial.
Why is stage 3 so expensive? Is that the sheer numbers? Are we talking about thousands of people?
We're talking about thousands to tens of thousands. In this case, we were going to want to look at tens of thousands of people. And we're looking at them very closely. So these people are tracked in multiple ways during the time of the trial.
You mentioned that our tolerance for risk in terms of vaccinations is low. Why is that?
Because we give vaccines to healthy people, we want to make sure that we're giving them something that is very, very safe. A 1 in 10,000 serious harm is higher than we stomach for modern vaccine. A vaccine that has a 1 in 10,000 a serious adverse reaction probably won't make it to market.
What would be an acceptable risk factor?
In theory, it's a risk-benefit analysis. But again, the risks of COVID are higher, substantially higher than 1 in 10,000. And still, we wouldn't accept a vaccine that causes a serious harm in 1 in 10,000. Exactly because, again, we're giving it to many people who are healthy and who might never be exposed to COVID-19.
What's an example from perhaps a comparable vaccination?
To give you an example, the United States stopped using the oral polio vaccine, which causes paralysis, causes wild polio in 1 in 2.4 million doses. After the 1990s, that was considered too high. Right now, modern routine vaccine cause a severe allergic reaction in 1 in a million, more or less. That's usually treatable. So it usually doesn't cause long-term harm, but a severe allergic reaction is a very dangerous thing. If it's not treated, it can be fatal. So 1 in a million is considered okay, especially since most of them are treated.
You mentioned that for phase 3, we're talking about thousands of people and an extended period of time. How long are we talking about in terms of monitoring? Because one thing that you can't accelerate is long-term effects.
So I'm going to answer you in 2 parts. Part 1, the current trials are designed to monitor people for 24 months. That doesn't mean we'll have to wait 2 years for data from the trial, but they will be monitored for the 24 months. The other part is that long-term harms from vaccines are generally rare. Usually if there's a problem, you see it early.
We're talking about the importance of vaccines and the urgency to get a vaccine quickly. But before we go forward, perhaps we should touch on the dangers of getting one out perhaps too quickly.
So there's at least 3 that I can think of. The first is that we end up with a vaccine that has a side effect we haven't anticipated in more than 1 per 10,000, and we end up harming people with something that's supposed to help them. That has happened in the past, rarely, for some vaccines that weren't necessarily rushed. But also in 1976, the swine flu vaccine was connected to a severe side effect, GBS, Guillain-Barré syndrome, which causes paralysis, usually not permanent, but is a very serious reaction. So one is we may have safety issues. Second, we may end up with a vaccine that doesn't actually prevent the disease or doesn't prevent it for more than a few months. Then we haven't solved the problem, and we may be going out and acting unsafely under the illusion that the problem is solved. Third, more long-term, if this vaccine backfires, we may have mistrust in vaccines in general, and we may be giving more ground to claims against vaccines that are tested, are well supported by data, and that will lead people to be more vaccine hesitant and bring back other diseases.
Which is a very scary thought. We like to think of Americans as being logical or open to the latest science, but there's only a certain amount of trust, and if it's blown on a vaccine prematurely, it can have long-term negative consequences.
We're all human. If trust is lost, it may affect more than just the current vaccine, and it may be hard to separate out. If you start trusting sites that have been crying wolf about this vaccine, you may trust them on other things.
Before we move forward, are there examples historically where we've rushed to market, I suppose, and pushed a vaccine out too soon that wasn't properly tested?
So in the 1950s, in the Qatar incident, what we had was manufacturers improperly inactivated a polio vaccine. That was a vaccine that was supposed to have a dead virus. And what they ended up shipping out was a vaccine that had live polio virus.
So they were accidentally shipping actual polio out to individuals.
Exactly, accidentally. Nobody planned it, but the result was that over 200,000 children were injected with live polio, basically, and over 200 were paralyzed and 11 died. That was a horrible tragedy. It wasn't rushing a vaccine past testing, but it was in the early days of manufacturing. There wasn't good oversight, and the result was a tragedy.
I have to imagine that massive mistakes like that are what led to the regulations being what they are today.
We had several scandals that led to a very robust regulatory regime over vaccine safety that we have now. We haven't had such scandals for many years, but when you're trying to act fast, we may go back to some of it.
Talking about acting fast, maybe you can quickly explain what is Operation Warp Speed.
So the idea of Operation Warp Speed is a very reasonable idea, which is there's some things we can make more efficient in the vaccine development and manufacturing process. There are some things that can be sped up by injecting money without compromising safety. Those are some things that can't, but something that can. But we need coordination. Operation Warp Speed looks like a coordination effort by the federal government to coordinate the different agencies that have to get together and the different companies that are working on this in one place. That makes a lot of sense. The name is bad. Warp Speed isn't a good name for this, but the idea of coordinating is a reasonable idea. The question is, how do you do that? One of the concerns I have, and I think we all should have, is the lack of transparency. We don't know enough about what Operation Warp Speed is doing.
Maybe we could quickly touch on an international question, which is, once the vaccines are created, does the United States have some type of legal right to have first dibs, since the government is putting up some of the money?
So for the vaccines that we're supporting, the government has bought in the hundreds of millions of doses from a few companies for vaccines that aren't yet approved, which is a financial risk, but not a safety risk. We don't have to buy them if they don't come out.
Have they bought these doses, whether they're effective or not, or have they bought them only if they're effective?
So here's where I would really like to see the contracts, and I haven't seen the contract. My reading of the Warp Speed site is that they're bought regardless, that they're already pre-ordering them. But I would really want to see the contract.
And if that is the case, potentially if one of the vaccines is promising, but another one isn't, that might be 100 million doses that were tossed in the trash.
There are efforts on a global level to coordinate. There have been early efforts to coordinate the vaccine development process, and there's still efforts to have global coordination of the distribution, but the United States has explicitly took itself out of that, said it does not want to be part of the global coordination effort.
The fact that we are in such a globalist world, you mentioned, you and I were discussing off camera how, if one country has access to the vaccine and another doesn't, it remains a risk to the global system. Some have described it like peeing in the swimming pool. We're all still swimming in the same pool.
Yeah. If someone outside the United States is infected with COVID-19 and comes into the United States, and it can be one of our citizens that went abroad and came back, COVID-19 is reintroduced. With a global pandemic, you have to solve it everywhere or it's not solved.
Can the government require someone to get the COVID-19 vaccination?
Which government? State or federal? The answer is
important question.
So there's a number of tiers of that. First of all, the federal government can probably not require all citizens in the United States to get the vaccine because it's not within one of its powers. It can, on the other hand, for example, condition getting a passport on getting a COVID-19 vaccine. If the government sets a condition of getting passport, there are limits to that because the right to travel is a fundamental right, but it can set conditions for getting a passport. Or it can set conditions if it affects interstate commerce. For example, it can say, if you have a trucking company that goes across state, your drivers have to get the COVID-19 vaccines to be licensed. States have broader power. States have the plenary power to regulate in the public health. That means,
is this the same as the police power, or is this a different power?
So plenary power means that means that everything that isn't given expressly to the federal government is left to the state. One of those is a power to regulate in the public health. In 1905, the Supreme Court upheld a smallpox vaccine mandate on the grounds that individual rights can be set aside when it's in the public health.
This was the Jacobson decision?
Yes, that's Jacobson versus Massachusetts in 1905.
And there, even in 1905, you had an example of a state, or in that case, I think it might have been a city, requiring individuals to get the vaccination.
Exactly right. The state of Massachusetts allowed cities to require vaccination from adults or fine them criminally $5, which is higher today, if they didn't get the vaccine. Cambridge, who had a smallpox outbreak, for a number of reasons, it's unclear that Jacobson would allow a universal state adult mandate for a vaccine. First, even Jacobson was about allowing cities to mandate it during an outbreak. Second, our respect for bodily autonomy has increased since Jacobson. Third, a $5 mandate during an outbreak isn't throwing people in jail without one. And fourth, smallpox isn't COVID. COVID is dangerous. It's a very serious disease. But smallpox had a 30% death rate, with the more aggressive strain of it. So smallpox was an extremely dangerous disease. I think the state would have a better chance of legally requiring vaccines the narrower it goes. So, for example, there's nothing stopping the state from saying all healthcare professionals that work with COVID patients have to get a COVID-19 vaccine unless they have a medical reason not to. There's nothing stopping the state from saying meat plant workers, essential workers in places that are high risk, have to get a COVID-19 vaccines. But the universal mandate, unless there's an area that has high risk, might be harder to justify in court.
So there's some kind of a balancing test here. If the disease was much more deadly or much even more contagious than it is, there could be a requirement for every American or every resident to get a test, to get a vaccination. But
exactly
what you would expect for this particular vaccine is niche industry, or is specific industries,
or high risk areas or hotspots.
High risk areas.
Children are trickier. So traditionally, there's a lot more power to mandate vaccines for children because children don't have the same level of autonomy as adults. So you're not just protecting the public health, you're protecting the child. The problem here is that COVID-19 does cause a special syndrome that's dangerous to children, but it's still a lower risk than many other diseases we vaccinate children against. So there's a question, can we mandate it for children? It will partly depend on the risk profile of the vaccine. A super safe vaccine against a disease that does sometimes kill children and that does sometimes cause them serious harm is a lot more justifiable than a vaccine with some serious risk.
Interesting. So the fact that COVID itself doesn't seem to have the same danger to children as some of the other diseases that are in-state mandates may mean that a COVID vaccination mandate might not happen.
Yes. Also remember that right now we're testing COVID in adults. We haven't started trials in children at all. So children are way down the line, for good or bad, for mandates as well. I will add one more thing. States are not the only ones that can mandate. Private employers can mandate, stores can mandate, and they have quite a bit of leeway.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So, if I run a barbershop, Joel's Barbershop, and I want to make sure that all my hair cutters are vaccinated, can I require it?
Yes. So a private employer in the United States can generally set health and safety conditions. There's a few limits. One is if your barbers are unionized, you may have to follow the collective bargaining agreement, and some of them would require you to negotiate with the union before you require it. The other is federal anti-discrimination law applied to employers that have more than 15 people. That's the American with Disability Act, which would require exempting someone with a disability with some exceptions. And the Civil Rights Act, most relevantly, may exempt people with sincere religious objections to vaccine, again, with exceptions.
And those tests are actually different on the two laws. So the ADA requirements are a little bit more stringent.
That's exactly right. The ADA, so to be exempt from the ADA, you have to either show that the person is a direct threat to others, which you may be able to show depending on the circumstances, or that it's a very significant burden on you, the employer, to accommodate their disability. For the Civil Rights Act, you just have to show that the burden is more than de minimis, more than minimal cost.
So as long as it's something legitimate, serious, which in the case of COVID-19 would arguably be easy to show.
Well, yes and no, because so what you need to do if you have to give the exemption is to give what's called a reasonable accommodation. So if you can achieve the same health benefits with a mask for the employee, then that's a minimal burden on you. You can still achieve the safety. If you have a reasonable alternative to keep the employee working for you, but reduce the risk to your customers, then you have to provide that.
Interesting. So if social distancing and mask wearing offered the same reduction,
or if, for example, you have some workers that are customer facing and some workers that work isolated in little cubes without contact with anyone, you can say unvaccinated workers can stay with working for me. They have to work in that cube.
Another concept that's been raised is requiring some type of proof of vaccination, perhaps to fly internationally. Is that something that you see on the horizon or even legally possible?
First of all, some countries in Africa require proof of vaccination for yellow fever to come in. It's legally possible. There's limits because the right to travel is a fundamental right, but this is probably justified enough to do it. There's no absolute right to get on a plane. The problem will be a practical enforcement problem. How do you enforce that? People don't always have the vaccination record. They won't always have them available. This might be actually easier for flight because people are already used that they need to bring certain documents in order to be able to fly and meet certain requirements. If you try to do it for, let's say, Amtrak trains, buses, traveling across toll roads, you may run into very real enforcement problems.
When it comes to the vaccine process, what oversight, what legally mandated watchdog is there to make sure that the process is moving along safely?
So even in routine times, there's at least 2 expert advisory committees that are outside the government that are watching this, in addition to the civil servant experts in the FDA. From before the vaccine is licensed, and this is true for these vaccines as well, Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee and the FDA, which is a group of experts that are not part of the FDA. Many of them are university professors, and they include a consumer representative, is looking at the material on the vaccine. Others are the civil servants in the FDA. Also, before the vaccine is licensed, the Advisory Commission of Immunization Practices in the CDC, another committee of 15 experts and a consumer representative, starts following the vaccine, creates a work group, and gives presentation about the data of the vaccine. And they've been doing it since April. So we have 2 expert committees that are closely overseeing the vaccine. For COVID-19 vaccine, we have in addition a special group in the National Institute of Health, the NIH, called ACTIVE, another expert committee that's advising and overseeing how the vaccine development process is working. And these 3 different expert committees are closely overseeing the data and can and will raise problems as they come along. They ask very.
So do they have the ability to halt trials? Do they have the ability just to shine light on what's actually happening?
Yeah.
Or something in between?
The companies are running the trials. However, the companies want the FDA approval. If these committees see a problem, as you said, they can make it public, and their meetings are public. The Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices has a webcast of its meetings, so does the Vaccine and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. They're both meet in public. So first of all, problems will come up in public, and second, they don't directly tell the companies what to do. But if you know that your vaccine isn't going to be recommended because a group of experts think it isn't safe, continuing to work on it is kind of a waste of time.
So they can play an important role in terms of course correction throughout the process. We've talked through how vaccines are approved here in the United States. How about if we're talking about vaccines developed, let's say in China or Russia? If we start to see that their vaccines are working, are effective, and are being widely distributed, is there a process for the FDA to approve a foreign vaccine?
The company creating the vaccine would have to convince the FDA that it meets its standard. It would basically have to show data from the 3 stages that the FDA looks at. The FDA will be cautious, and rightly so. The Russian vaccine has been apparently approved without going through stage 3 trials. That's a big concern. There isn't data behind it. Maybe it's safer and effective, but it hasn't gone through trials that would show that. The Chinese vaccines are going through trials. However, we've had some vaccine scandals when the Chinese regulatory authorities in the past few years failed to oversee the vaccines, resulting in, it's not so much a safety problem, but ineffective vaccines ended up being sold. Now, they reformed the regulatory regime, but it's a new regime. We don't know if it works. So the FDA will be cautious.
Well, Professor Reiss, we appreciate you taking the time to walk us through this complicated and interesting topic, and perhaps we can have you back as the vaccine process moves forward.
Yes. Well, let's see how we end up in a year or two. We all hope that we'll have an effective vaccine in the near future and that we can end this situation.
Professor Reiss, thank you for your time.